Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Damn Busters, the RAF Bomber Command podcast with me, James Jefferies, and Jane Gulliford Lowes. Today is the last episode of Series 1, and that means that it's our Christmas special. And we want to wish our listeners a very happy Christmas 2024. Can you believe it, Jane? It's Christmas time already. Have you got everything ready? And what actually have you been up to since we last spoke?
All right, can I just say, before we go into what I've been up to, the fact that this series ends on episode 29 is really sort of playing with my CD. I can't really handle that. We should have done 30 or 32, but this is going to be episode 29. Anyway, am I ready?
I thought it was 28.
No, it's 29. Am I ready for Christmas? Well, it's now the 11th of December when we're recording this. I have not bought a single present. I haven't got my tree up yet, and nor have I a single decoration up. So the answer to that is no, and I'm now getting into a bit of a mad panic. But I shall be addressing all of this at the weekend. Anyway, so there we go. How about you? What have you been up to?
It's just been moving house. I've made a bed today. And as I was playing with the word, I was kind of like half imagining I was building a mosquito or something much more interesting than a bed, as you do. All right. That's about it. That's just dominated. But I have started getting my books out, and I've got my desk, and I've got the internet up and running now, so I could start, getting on with things again. So yeah, that's mainly been me, I think.
Excellent. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about what Christmas was like for bomber crews and ground staff during the Second World War. To talk us through, I'm delighted to say that we are joined once again by Dr Dan Ellin, archivist to the International Bomber Command Centre Digital Archive and good friend of the podcast. You now qualify as a friend of the show, Dan. I hate that expression, but yeah. How are you? Yeah.
I've been suffering a bit from man flu, but I'm winning because we've started doing the Christmas stuff already. I have had Whamageddon a couple of days ago.
I'm so sorry.
Well, it's a good tune. It's all right. And I've got some of the family downstairs decorating the tree, which we bought yesterday. So the strains of Jethro Tull's Christmas album might suddenly start percolating up from downstairs.
Like it. Yeah. Excellent. Right. So let's get really stuck into what we're going to be talking about today. So, Dan, what we would like you to tell us about is what Christmas was like typically on an RAF bomber station, and perhaps tell us about some of the Christmas-related items that you have in the digital archive for the IBCC.
Yeah, so I mean, I had a look at some of the items we had in the archive, and I was looking especially at 1943 because that's the middle year of the war, and I think that's you sort of suggested I might want to look at that. And there's a fair few things in the archive about Christmas in 1943, and some of them give you a few ideas. But I guess the point is, it was another day pretty much. Whatever happened throughout the rest of the year could also happen on Christmas Eve or indeed on Christmas Day. Some of the items we have in the archive, there's a fair few Christmas dinner menus, which kind of gives you a bit of an idea of what people were getting up to, or at least what they were eating. They are special menus, and some of them have been signed by people on the back and things like that. What always makes me chuckle is they put cigarettes and beer down as one of the courses in the menus.
Oh dear.
So we've got a couple of menus from RAF SNAIF, which are worth looking at. I can send you the link so you can put those in your socials. We've also got a Christmas menu from Stalag 4B.
Oh gosh!
This is part of the collection from James Roy Lee. He flew ops as a flight engineer with 467 Squadron, became a prisoner of war. So you can, if you want to go and have a look in the archive, you can compare and contrast what officers' messes were getting and what the sergeants' messes were getting, and what they were, what were they putting together inside prisoner of war camps. There's other ones from RAF Grimsby or RAF Waltham. The copy we've got there, crew signatures on the reverse, and it's signed all the crew of 3 Engine Charlie. So obviously this is a Lancaster that must have returned with one engine out. So some of the stations and places, they sort of put together their own little newsletters. and there was a place called Mere Y Station. It's in Branson, near the IBCC in Lincoln. And it was a listening station. So it was a radio station where the WAFs were listening into German broadcasts and writing down basically the strings of Enigma letters. And they put together their little newspaper. It came out monthly. It was called Mere Gen, so Gen Information. And the Christmas edition of 1943, it's quite poignant because at some point they're sort of hoping that this was going to be the last Christmas of the war. So 1943, they were hoping it was the last Christmas.
Yeah.
So it's a little duplicated magazine produced by the personnel at Branson Mere Y Station. It's got jokes, stories, quizzes, cartoons, poems and things like that. But the thing that really got me, again, was a collection belonged to a WAF called Katie Reed, she worked in the watch office at RAF Waltham. And she wrote a poem called Happy Christmas. You have a couple of copies of it because there are different drafts in the archive. And it's like the whole Christmas tradition that goes back to Dickens, I guess, of Christmas ghost stories and not necessarily Christmas is always being happy. And it goes back to my point that Christmas Day was just another day. So her poem, Happy Christmas. We called cheerily to our friends. Hard to believe that on Christmas Eve, how quickly happiness ends. Goes on in this vein. Our Lancaster crews, flying safely back after battling through Berlin's fighters and flak, homing to Waltham through cloud base too low, nowhere to divert to, nowhere else to go. With fuel finished, so nearly home, they crash-landed on the fog-bound drone. On this Christmas night, 18 of our young air crew are laying dead in the medical flight, along with 44 killed the night before. If we search through life, will we find why our brave bomber boys had to suffer and die? Please God, we will not find they died for nothing. Wow. So, Merry Christmas, folks.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting because what's actually happened, and you've had people talk on the podcast about the way memory works. I don't know when this poem was written. I've looked in the Losses database to see what story she was writing about, and she's actually, I think, that conflated a couple of different events. So on the 24th of December 1943, two Lancasters, one from 100 Squadron and one from 550 Squadron, climbing away from RAF Grimsby, Waltham, the two Lancasters collided and they crashed somewhere near between Grimsby and Louth with the deaths of all those involved. But I think that the story that she's remembering in the poem about aircraft returning from operations in the fog happened on the 16th of December 1943 when a 100 Squadron Lancaster crashed on Hatcliffe Top while returning to Waltham from Berlin. The airfield was fog-bound on that night. The crew were on the third operation.
God.
And of course, they're all remembered in the IBCC Losses database and more. So, happy Christmas, folks.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, right? When we were preparing this episode, I thought, right, we'll do a Christmassy, an episode. But the more I looked into Christmas during the war, the more I thought, well, there's absolutely nothing to be cheery about. Whether whichever side you're on, for the bomber crews, it was utterly horrendous. And for the people on the receiving end of their efforts, it was utterly horrendous. We can't shy away from that. And I think that that's something that we've always tried to do in this podcast is to deal with the realities of the situation. With regard to Christmas 43, I'm just going to quickly mention a little bit from Above the Stars about my uncle and his crew's experiences around that time of December 43. So on the 20th of December, they'd been sent out to a raid on Frankfurt. This was their 14th op. Now, bear in mind, they'd been on station since the middle of May 1943, and they were only up to 14, so they still had another 16 technically to go. So absolutely unending for them. It was just horrendous. So I just want to kind of share with you a little bit about what went on. Jack's logbook records raid on Frankfurt 14 in bracket to signify that it was their 14th raid. Defences moderate, target illuminated by fighter flares and searchlight. 1 Ju-88 sighted over target area, rather a scattered prang. So as the returning crews were debriefed and supplied with sandwiches and tea laced with rum, no doubt, it became increasingly apparent that this had been a really dreadful night for the men of 10 Squadron. So after Sergeant Fenny and his crew landed 20 minutes before midnight in Yorker, no further aircraft were heard to make their approach. No calls came in from other airfields to report the safe arrival of stragglers or any other damaged aircraft. The WAFs and air traffic control staff were stood down around about 2 o'clock in the morning. The 3 aircraft of the 16 sent out had failed to return, those of Pilot Officer Whitmarsh, Sergeant Borthwick and Sergeant Morris. Now, Whitmarsh and his crew were among the most experienced and popular crews on the squadron. They'd been there probably since about June, and Frankfurt was their 16th operation. All were killed when their aircraft K King crashed near Darlin. My other uncle, who was one of the ground crew on the squadron, and this was one of his crew's, his ground crew team's aircraft that they maintained, and they knew Whitmarsh, who'd actually been an aeronautical engineer before the war, and his crew very well. Now, Whitmarsh and his crew are buried, like many others, at Rheinberg War Cemetery. Sergeant Borthwick's crew had taken part in just 4 other raids, and he was killed along with 3 of his crewmen. He was just 23. 3 others survived and were taken prisoner. Sergeant Morris and his men had only arrived at the squadron on the 30th of November. So they'd only been there, 3 weeks. Morris went down with his aircraft, but 4 of the crew managed to bail out successfully and were captured. This had been their first and only operation. Their families received notification that they were missing in action Christmas Eve. So I think that really gives you sort of an idea of the realities, really. But this... You know, there wasn't anything special about this. This is what happened all the time, night after night on every raid. For Jack's crew at Frankfurt, it had just been one more operation to tick off the list. But in the 7 months that they'd been on, 10th Squadron, 39 aircraft and their crews had been lost. So the odds were poor indeed. And I think at this point in time, during that time, there was only 1 crew had actually fully completed the full tour in December. So they had...
So this is 43?
Yeah, 43.
Is it? So this is the middle of the Battle of Berlin, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely horrendous time. So they had traditional Christmas dinner in the mess, followed by the usual boozing, dancing and hijinks. And obviously as the pints go down, their bravado increases, doesn't it? And you can just imagine all the WAFs being chinted up amongst the haze of cigarette and pipe smoke, occasional punch-up breaking out between the rivals for their affections. So, yeah, noise and laughter everywhere, the gramophone belting out tunes, etc. Beneath this sort of facade of frivolity, if you like, every man knew that the chances of his seeing another Christmas were, quite frankly, extremely slim. One of the guys that they actually took out on the Frankfurt trip, they had a second dickie, a guy called Large, who went out as their eighth crew member that night for his first trip out, seeing what it was all like, what the lie of the land was. That poor guy was dead within the month. And again, that's nothing unusual. It's just unendingly horrible. And then, obviously, on the ground, well, it's just unimaginable, really, isn't it? Absolutely unimaginable. So that was Jack's experiences of Christmas 43.
I was going to say that winter of 43, 44 with the Battle of Berlin and everything going on, I imagine is probably the most miserable for, the personnel at bomber stations. And I had a look at the brilliant and very useful Bomber Command War Diaries, Middlebrook and Everett, and just what was going on around there. And you're quite right, Jane, as well, to mention what was happening on the ground. And of course, in 1940, there was the Blitz and bombing around Christmas. But just in the build-up, the Battle of Berlin, you got a raid on Frankfurt, 650 aircraft take part, 41 aircraft are lost, 27 Halifaxes, 14 Lancasters, 6.3% of the force, so just a few days before Christmas. You've also got Berlin on the 23rd to 24th of December, where the bombs end up being scattered. 16 Lancasters are lost, 4.2% of the force, 178 people killed on the ground, 157 civilians, 11 police and soldiers, 10 foreign workers, and a Beaufighter was also lost on minor operations, which are trips to other cities and towns. It's just non-stop, isn't it? Even over Christmas, and you can imagine that's the 23rd, 24th of December 43. And people finding out over Christmas, maybe, a couple of days afterwards, that they toast their loved ones over the dinner table, not knowing that they'd been lost 2 days before, maybe just finding out that they'd been lost. Yeah, this isn't a cheery episode at all, is it? But it's worth highlighting and saying,
Yeah, but that's the reality of the situation.
The only sort of cheery spin I can think of putting on it is the Australians get a chance to see snow.
Yay!
That's true. That's true.
Bonus, yeah.
There's a few letters in the archive of Australians writing, being very excited because they're getting to see snow for the first time.
Oh,
There's photos as well of them.
Oh, wonderful.
Throwing snowballs and playing silly buggers. Think by the time they're all told to put on their greatcoats and go help shovel the snow off the aircraft and the dispersals and the runways, they're not quite so happy about it.
Yeah. And of course, the ground staff would have still run engines and done all their winter tasks over this period as well. They would have had a day off. No one would have had an altogether.
Yeah, and the mechanics. There's story saying there is nothing as horrible and as miserable as a cold Merlin engine on a dispersal in the middle of December.
We've got that great picture of Leo, who we just talked about. My great uncle sat there in a little tent on the edge of the field. They're actually sat in the snow, trying to warm their hands, like on a little brazier or whatever. I think that gives and it looks really, really grim. It looks absolutely horrible. I think that gives a really good illustration of what it was like for the ground crews as well, who frequently get overlooked. Yeah. So now we are going to move on to telling some of the lovely family stories that our listeners have very kindly sent in. We've picked out 3 for now. There were many more to consider, but we've chosen these 3 for this particular episode. But we will be reading out more lovely family stories at a later date and in subsequent episodes. I think it's so nice to hear from listeners with their family experiences and
definitely.
Yeah. So there's some funny ones, there's some sad ones, there's some sort of in between. So we'll just see how we go with that. So Dan, I think you're going to read out our first one. And that comes from Heather Evans.
Yeah. So this is the watch from Heather Evans, who is she's the granddaughter of Cyril Rowland Strathy Roswell, DFC. And she wrote into the podcast saying, "This was a story that we loved hearing my grandfather, a wireless operator, tell, although the watch was never seen until after he passed and my mother came into possession. My mother took it upon herself to write up the story, and it's this version I'm choosing to send along to you. She passed away in August. I now have this watch, and no matter its true heritage, it's a treasure to me. And the story that goes with it. The watch that we know as Cyril's RAF watch came to him by a circuitous route. The route is the story. My father, Cyril Rowland Strathy Roswell, joined the RAF at St John's in 1940, immediately after his 18th birthday. Once accepted into the Air Force, he was sent to Quebec City for initial training, later to the Canadian West for flying, and then back to Quebec City for radio training. From here, he was shipped to England. He initially served on the southwest coast of England and then later in Northern England on Bomber Command. It was in Northern England that he met and became friends with a New Zealander, also in the RAF, who claimed to have had a Maori heritage. The New Zealander had become a member of the RAF, much the same as Dad in New Zealand, but probably somewhat earlier. As part of his kit, he'd been issued a watch. This was much admired by the boys on the squadron. The New Zealander became friends with Dad, but spooked by many of the boys, Dad's phrase, as he claimed to have second sight from his Maori granny. Dad paid little attention to the claims and figured it was just a way of entertaining the guys as they sat round the barracks in the evenings. He would go round the room pointing out this guy and that, and would add, "He will make it, he won't, he won't, he will," referring, of course, to those who would survive to the end of the war. This was unnerving for the men and made some feel uneasy. He always told Dad he would make it. Once he was asked if he himself would make it, and the answer was a flat no. One evening my father was out in the town with the boys. This usually involved drinking in the local pub and having a grand time. When Dad checked in at the barracks that night, the watchman for the barracks told Dad that the New Zealander had dropped by with the parcel. He'd had a sortie that night and was dropping it off before he left. As Dad had loaned him some money a little while before, and his friend always paid it back, Dad was expecting a few pounds in an envelope. It was not. It was a watch. Dad was surprised. He was shocked the next day when counts came in for the lost aircraft from the unit. The New Zealander had been lost over Europe. This watch remained a treasure to Dad as he remembered his New Zealand friend. Wow.
Heather adds to that story, "I now know that my grandfather actually signed up in February 1940. He didn't turn 18 until the December, and it was January 41 before he actually shipped up to Canada to begin his training. He was very proud of that and loved to get loved to chuckle about getting one over on his mother, who was not pleased about the situation. So another situation where someone had actually enlisted before they were 18. We've had a few of those that we've talked about in previous episodes. Yeah. Heather continues, "Oh my, he always found the stories to chuckle about, and those are the ones he told most often. I've learned so much since doing my own research, and I wish I had asked so much more. Alas, I'm sure that was the case of many." Yeah, I can confer with that.
Wow.
And you can see a photograph of Cyril and the treasured pocket watch on our social media. We'll put that up for you so you can have a look. James, I think you're going to read our next story.
Yes, this is from Bill Dawson about his great uncle, Pilot Officer Ralph Henderson, DFM. Ralph Henderson was born on the 29th of March 1910 in Sunderland, County Durham, the youngest of 5 children. Within a year, the family settled in Blyth, Northumberland. Ralph did very well in school, and despite only being 16, he emigrated to Australia to work under the Big Brother scheme, where young men were sponsored to go out to work and train for farming. It seems that after a while, he became bored with the farming business and trained in Australia to become a teacher. He worked in the outback until returning to England in 1937, where he briefly worked as a salesman before enrolling on the Column College in Oxford in 1938, a teacher training college. Ralph did very well at college, gaining good reports. His main subjects were physical education and woodwork. We still have an oak cabinet in the family that he made, which is very precious. He graduated in 1940. The testimonial from the principal noted, "Mr. Henderson is a man of outstanding ability and one of the best teachers who ever passed through this college." I volunteered for the RAF as soon as he was able to do so, and he reported for duty with the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve at the recruiting centre in Uxbridge on the 5th of October 1940. He began his basic recruit training at Stratford-upon-Avon before moving to Scarborough to commence pilot training. Ralph was selected for the very first course to sail to America for flying training in the United States under what was to become known as the Arnold Scheme. In May 1941, Ralph sailed to America to the liner Britannic, now a 27,000-ton troop ship capable of 18 knots. They arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia on the 29th of May 1941, from where they embarked on trains for a 30-hour trip to Toronto, then began a 10-day journey across America to their final destinations. Ralph had been streamed to a course in the Americas, Atlanta, Georgia, and for his basic flying training. The local townsfolk, for whom the war was still a distant news item, greeted the students with great interest and friendship. Many of the young RAF pilots were adopted by local families for 2 months that they stayed, borrowing cars and attending local dances. Their unusual accents, manners, and enthusiasm for life were popular locally, and they often appeared on local newspapers, taking part in sports and events. Ralph continued to write letters to his American family after he returned to England. Ralph completed his training in November 1941 and was posted to the Advanced Flying Unit at RAF Lincolnfield in Yorkshire to commence his conversion training to larger multi-engine aircraft in Christmas C1. Throughout the course of his training, Ralph wrote to Muriel, a lady he had met at college, and they began seeing each other whenever they could. Ralph was selected to join the Pathfinder Force and joined 83 Squadron at RAF Whitton in March 1943, flying Lancasters. As was usual, he flew a couple of missions with other crews to familiarise himself with the routines and drills and to gain some experience of combat. This was known as flying as Second Dickie. On only his third operation in the early hours of the 12th of March 1943, Ralph's aircraft was shot down. The Lancaster OLB ED-313 was returning from a raid over Stuttgart when it was intercepted and shot down by Feldwebel Gerhard Rass in an ME-110. It was his first claimed kill of the war. The Lancaster pilot, Flight Lieutenant Norman Mackey, ordered the crew to bail out. The 2 gunners, Flight Sergeant Alexander Lynch and Sergeant Kenneth Chipcase, were killed. The rest of the crew were captured, but Ralph and the navigator, Joe Ogilvie, evaded capture and, with the help of the French resistance, made it to Spain and eventually back to England. On the 4th of August 1943, Ralph and Muriel were married in Oxford. When he returned to flying duties after the wedding, Muriel was able to meet him on occasional weekends, travelling by train through the blackout of returning to work on a Monday. Only 2 weeks after their wedding, Ralph returned to the squadron and commenced operational flying again. On his 14th flight, array to Berlin on the 22nd of November 1943, in Lancaster OLB, JB Ralph was shot down and killed, along with all of his crew, over Berlin. It seems likely from the information that OLB had come in towards the south of the city and was tracking north over the zoo area when it was hit, likely by radar-guided flak from the zoo flak tower. The aircraft was noted to have exploded in mid-air. Muriel was informed by telegram the next day from the CO of 83 Squadron. Over the coming months, Muriel never gave up hope and wrote repeatedly to the Red Cross seeking more information. She also wrote to the families of all the other crew members offering reassurance and holding out hope. Sadly, a telegram was eventually received from the Red Cross on the 8th of January 1944 confirming that he was believed to have been lost. Ralph and his crews were buried in Berlin. After the war, Muriel received an invitation to Buckingham Palace to receive Ralph's DFM from King George VI. His Majesty also sent her a personal card of sympathy. Ralph is also commemorated on a plaque in his hometown of Blyth on the RAF Memorial at Runnymede, and a tree was planted in his memory at the National Memorial Arboretum. Muriel never remarried, staying faithful to the memory of Ralph and the short 3.5 months of marriage that they enjoyed, even around the disruptions of his operational flying career. She kept personal papers and memorabilia of their life together, which she stored safely in the oak cabinet that he made during his time at Culham College, where they first met. Muriel died peacefully in 2016. And again, we'll put photographs of Ralph and Muriel on our social media. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing Ralph's story.
Oh, that was lovely. So sad, but lovely. I always think it's so tragic when you hear about, these girls who are married for a couple of months and then lose their husbands and then, never remarry and spend the rest of their lives in mourning, really. It's so very sad. On a more upbeat note, we're going to conclude with story number 3. This is from Stuart Bertie, who some of you will know. Formerly independent company, we have Wales Community, etc. Stuart is an architect and the most fabulous photographer, and he's got some absolutely cracking wartime stories in connection with his family. I've heard the one about the U-boat, but this is another one still. This is a different one. So Stuart begins. During my childhood, when I was staying with my grandmother in Portsmouth, I would often go with her to visit my great-uncle Arthur. He lived nearby in Bedhampton by the railway line. He would tell me about his time flying aeroplanes on the RAF, and I was always enthralled with his stories. Uncle Arthur, as he was known, worked for Frank Whittle before World War II and joined the RAF at the beginning of the war, having learnt to fly in the late 1930s. He eventually found himself as a bomber pilot, flying Vickers Wellingtons on 103 Squadron, based out of RAF Newton. It was on a mission to Germany that he had his first experience of a forced landing. On January the 9th, 1941, he was in Vickers Wellington R3215, which was the mainstay of the night bomber offensive against Germany at this time. They took off from RAF Newton in Nottinghamshire to make a night attack against the synthetic oil producing plant Gelsenkirchen in the Ruhr. The bomb load comprised 500-pound high explosive bombs and bundles of nickels, leaflets, to be released in the target area. The Wellington was piloted by Sergeant Critch, with Arthur as the second pilot, F. Wen as the navigator, J. Layfield, wireless operator, G. Chad and Norman Jock Cameron, front and rear gunners. They dropped their bombs on the target from about 13,000 feet, which was seen to have burst in factory buildings. Heavy and accurate flak was reported around the target area, and they were hit. During the return leg, they were running short of fuel, and without radio communications, after an hour or so, the pilot realised that the position was hopeless and was left with the choice of either abandoning the aircraft or attempting a forced landing. Convinced that they were still over enemy territory, they prepared to try to land. Sergeant Critch lowered the undercarriage and selected a field in which to land. The snow camouflaged the slope of the field down to a river. Not allowing for the unseen slope, he burst a tyre on landing and came to a halt, feet from electric wires slung across the field. Had they been hit, the aircraft would have burst into flames. The 6 crew suffered cuts and bruises, and 1 a broken arm. When they managed to exit the plane, there were men speaking a funny language and pointing guns at them, which clearly confirmed that they had landed in enemy territory. They tried to communicate in pidgin French and franglais that they were British airmen, etc. This, of course, convinced the locals that they were not, in fact, English, as they were speaking in such a strange way. After prolonged attempts to communicate, it transpired that the crew had in fact landed in Wales. The men with the guns were Welsh, and they'd landed in a field near White House Farm, Landover, near Abergavenny, where a searchlight unit was stationed. Orders had been given to treat all aircraft in the vicinity as hostile, and any assistance in landing that the searchlight unit could have given was therefore withheld. After being patched up, the crew were given lavish hospitality at the home of Major D. Berrington of Pantygoitra House, where they enjoyed the contents of a well-stocked cellar. Sadly, the Major's own son was to be killed 18 months later near Ross and Wye, piloting a Halifax. Arthur's crumpled Wellington was dismantled, loaded onto lorries, reassembled and put back into service. Locals remembered visiting the crash site with their school as small children and seeing the field still strewn with the remaining leaflets. During the debrief, the gunner said that they were looking for a place to land. They saw mountains and snow and thought they must have been flying the reciprocal of what they'd actually plotted, and that they were over Switzerland, hence the navigation confusion. But this, believe it or not, was not the end of this crew's adventures, though. And just a month later, again returning from a raid on Germany, the pilot was forced to ditch in the North Sea. So there they are in their dinghy. By day 2, strong easterly wind sprung up. By using a white scarf as a sail and by paddling with their flying boots, some progress was made towards the shore, which was visible. Goodness knows which shore, but it was visible. At 2200 hours that night, 3 ships were seen within hailing distance. Each ship answered the shouts of the airmen, the last slowing down and stopping. The dinghy came alongside of its own accord. How, the crew did not know. They were assisted on board by means of ropes and a rope ladder. By this time, nearly 48 hours after ditching, they were too exhausted to do much for themselves, owing to exposure and a lack of food. At least on this occasion, there were no angry Welshmen to deal with. What a story. This is just like a month after the Wales-Switzerland adventure as well. Good grief. And Uncle Arthur survived the war. So thanks so much, Stu. What a fabulous story to end on there. That was brilliant. Thanks so much for sending that in.
Incredible.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely love it. James, anybody else want to add anything else, or do you want to go to a wrap up now? Or...
Oh, Dan, I think you mentioned something about scarecrows in 43 and help from listeners.
Yeah. So reading a new book, it's the title of it has escaped me now, but it's published in 43. Bombers Fly West. And there is a very brief mention of scarecrows in there, and there's a chapter on gremlins. So I think it's absolutely fantastic. I was sort of labouring under the misapprehension that scarecrows didn't exist as a thing until a bit later in the war, and here they are in print, in a propaganda-based book that's aimed at the general public in 1943. So I'm on the lookout for any written evidence of scarecrows that anybody can find in 1943 or earlier, because I thought they were a sort of phenomenon that occurred in inverted commas in about 1944, not 1943. So if anybody comes across a mention of a scarecrow and something that was published early on in the war, I would love to know. Thank you, please.
I know that Jack's crew, his pilot, Reg Pennicott, mentioned what he called Christmas trees, which I assume were they the same thing, or was that something different?
Christmas trees are the marker flares that the Pathfinders dropped. And they hung in the sky, looking a bit like Christmas trees. It's what they were called by the people on the ground.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
I was never quite sure about the difference between the two. Yeah, that's really helpful. Gosh, how interesting.
Aircrows, when aircraft exploded after being hit by either anti-aircraft fire or forward-firing night fighters, if it was a Pathfinder aircraft, when their bomb load exploded and if they were carrying marker flares, they sort of, they went up with lots of pretty colours and fancy lights as well. But yeah, slightly different.
Interesting. Okay, well, I think in that case, it's probably time to wrap up. And did you see what I did there? That's a Christmas joke there, wrapping up.
God, dear.
Shouldn't that be reindeer, huh? Christmas
Behave.
stuff?
Yeah, Gordon Bennett.
But it is time for me to say a big thank you to Dan, the ever brilliant Dan Ellin, for coming back on the pod. Fascinating discussion. You might say it was a cracker, Jane.
Please,
Don't give up your day
stop.
job.
That's terrible. Yeah, don't give up the day job.
I'll stick to history. All right, go on. I've got something a little bit upbeat to end on.
Goodness.
But to our listeners, continue sending our questions, and also do give us a follow on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. The page on there, the group there is doing really well. We have regular little discussions and such like. That's really got a lot going at the moment. And also, don't forget to leave us a review or rating wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, and please do continue to send in your questions. We absolutely love them, and we'll answer as many as we can, as well as continuing to send in your family stories, and we'll read out as many of those as we possibly can. If you'd like to help us to produce more great content, then please hit that subscribe button in the show notes. From just £2.60 a month, or roughly, 65p an episode? What's that, a bag of crisps, bag of Monster Munch? You can subscribe and support the show. Subscribers receive early access to episodes, online socials, and lots more on the way.
Series 2 will be starting in early 2025 with lots of exciting episodes and guests planned. But excuse us a little bit of time off over the festive break, but we will see you early in 2025.
Yes, James and I are planning a well-earned rest over the Christmas period. I don't know about you, James. I'm absolutely worn out. I'm so shattered. Yeah, absolutely shattered. So yeah, we'll be back probably second week in January or so. And as James says, we've got some really, really interesting guests coming up. We're going to be talking about Bomber Command chaplains. We're going to be talking about bomber construction, all sorts of great stuff. So it's a goodbye and a happy Christmas and a New Year from me.
And it's a goodbye and a happy Christmas and New Year from her. Goodbye all.
Bye everyone. Thanks for listening.